I was debating what to speak about during my time up here on the dais, and I wanted to share with you some ideas and some principles that really changed how I saw what inclusive ministry is about. First, as some of the other speakers have shared, I think everyone that does disability ministry, we innately feel the need for serving some of our younger students differently from the way that we serve some of our older students. Like the 전도사님 from Sarang Church shared, we also saw our students aging at GM, where students that first started when they were just 5, 6, 7 years old over time became 15, 25, and older. As our students aged, we also saw that younger students were not participating in our ministry. A lot of times, parents would come, they would see our adult students in the classroom, and they would take their 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and in my experience, they didn't go to our education department. They would actually leave the church, and I would never see them again. We saw this week to week, many times over and over again. And we realized that we were losing people, in our church. So how could we set up a junior program that would better serve some of our younger children with disabilities? So we saw that inclusive ministry was the best solution because many of the parents with younger children with disabilities, they were not ready to send their children to a separate program. They wanted their children to interact with their peers. We felt that the children were better served by being in inclusive classrooms. And most importantly, these children were already experiencing inclusive classrooms at schools. The education system here in this country, here in the United States, is far ahead of our churches when it comes to including children with disabilities in classrooms. So when we started to address the needs of some of our junior students, we also started to see the needs of our senior students a little better as well. Before, when everybody was together, it was hard to differentiate between the needs of our older students and our younger students. By catering to specific needs, we also not only saw the needs of the younger students, but better understood how we could serve more effectively our older students and our adult students. One of the things that I started to do as we developed our GM Junior program is I started to look to academics. I started to look to how general education classrooms are set up here in the United States and how we got to this point where we were operating in more inclusive environments in our schools. Some of the principles that I thought were very enlightening was that first, our general education classrooms here in the United States operate under the assumption that all students are welcome in general education. All students are welcome in general education. Also, in our classrooms, disability is recognized as a form of human diversity. As such, students with disabilities are accepted as individuals and not denied access based on disability. This was very different from what I saw happening even in my own church. When a student with obvious disabilities came to our church, I felt that the first reaction was, how do we separate this student out? Not how do we get this student to belong in our program? A lot of the students and a lot of the teachers, and much of this due to lack of education, due to lack of experience, a lot of teachers were scared that by including a child with disability, not only would it disrupt the setting of the Sunday school, but also that they may have problems with the students themselves, that they may not understand how to serve that student, that they may actually end up harming that student. These are the assumptions that we all carry. These are the assumptions that our Sunday school was operating under. Another important point that I learned while studying general education classrooms is that there is much research done on the effects of inclusive classrooms, not just on students with disabilities, but on all students as well. Research has been done to see how inclusive classrooms affect not only students with disabilities, but students without disabilities. And the research shows that in most cases, all students benefit from inclusive classrooms. All students benefit from inclusive classrooms. One of the things they studied was academic performance. And you would think that in an inclusive classroom with kids with disabilities and without disabilities being mixed together, it would be a very disruptive environment where it would discourage learning and discourage academic progress. They actually found the exact opposite of that happening. In all cases that were studied, they found that academic progress was either the same or actually even better than in classes that were not inclusive. Some of the skills that students without disabilities were learning in those classrooms were leadership, better communication, empathy, the ability to care for others. And that challenged me because as a church, what are we trying to teach our students? As a church, what is the purpose of us coming together as a community? Isn't it to teach those very things? To teach our students, to teach our church members how to care for others? To teach us how to be empathetic to the situation and to the pains and sufferings and cares of those around us. One of the interesting things that I found is that one of the unique giftings of students with disabilities in these classrooms was that much of the social interaction that was happening in these inclusive classrooms was actually initiated by the students with disabilities. The students with disabilities were the ones that were going and were welcoming the other students to class. They were the ones that were making the effort to try to communicate. They were the ones that were actually bringing these classrooms together. So what are we missing out on, especially here at church, especially in our Sunday schools, when we exclude these students with disabilities, when we segregate these students with disabilities? It's not only harmful to those students, but what we have to come to understand is that we are harming even the students that don't have disabilities as well. They don't have the opportunity to interact with these peers. These lessons that are so hard to teach outside of the church, these lessons, these godly characteristics, these fruits of the Spirit that we want our children and our students to learn, they are losing the opportunity to learn those specific skills. Practically, as we began our GM Junior program, right now we have 11 students enrolled in GM Junior that are between the ages of kindergarten through 6th grade. And these students, they do attend Sunday school with a one-on-one partner, one-on-one buddy every Sunday. At first, we didn't know necessarily how to begin. This process of inclusion, it sounds great, but when you actually start to try to begin these programs, it's not that easy. There are a lot of hurdles. There are a lot of obstacles that we came across. One of the things was, what are we supposed to do on Sundays? Because not all of our students can actually sit through a full Sunday service. Even though we'd like them to, it's not good for our students. It's not necessarily great for the other students because in certain settings and in certain environments, our students have difficulties. So this principle of partial participation that was developed in academic settings was something that helped me navigate the newness of inclusion. This principle states that everyone can participate, at least in part, in most activities. In an educational setting, this principle holds that students do not necessarily need to be full participants in an educational activity for that activity to be deemed beneficial or worthwhile. Even students with significant intellectual disabilities can participate in part or to some extent in most activities. And I know, especially with Dr. Carter sitting there, I know that we are working towards eventually moving to full participation, but this was a great starting point for me. In partial participation, I came to the realization that we are all actually partial participants in worship. The Bible teaches us in 1 Corinthians 12 that right now that we only see in part. I want to experience the full glory of God, but not really, not on this earth at least. We are all partially participating in worship. It's just to what degree are we doing so? So for some of our students, they love music. They love to dance around. They love to sing with their voices. They love to sing with their bodies. That's how they love to worship God. Sitting through a Sunday sermon, not so great. Not so great. So some of these students, they sit through worship. They participate as much as they can. And when they get to a point in the service where they start to feel uncomfortable, then they're taken out of that environment. They either walk around with their one-on-one. They have come to a sensory room that we have available for them, where they can relax. They don't necessarily need to be stimulated at that same level. So we have options available for them. We have what we conceive of proper worship in this box. And especially in Korean churches, we stick to that order of service. We stick to those requirements no matter what. But those requirements are not necessarily godly requirements. God doesn't necessarily tell us that this is exactly the order of events that we have to follow in a worship service. God doesn't tell us that you have to sit through the full 30 minutes of the sermon or you get minus points for that Sunday. God doesn't tell us that you can't dance around, you can't get up and walk around during a worship service, that you have to sit completely still. Those are not requirements that are God-given, but those are the requirements that we impose on many of our students. Through this concept of partial participation, I learned that, hey, it's okay to think out of the box a little bit, that there are ways to navigate this space, that there are ways to navigate even a Korean church worship service where our students can participate, at least in part. They can receive, they can get something out of that service. That service can be beneficial for them, but we can still navigate that space in a way that's comfortable for our students and also comfortable for the other students around them. Initially, it was finding that balance that was so important for us. Another thing that this idea of partial participation taught me is that even in our senior service, it opened my eyes to the different things that we can do. I also, when I first started this ministry 7 years ago, I also had a concept that prayer has to be done a certain way, that worship has to be conducted a certain way. Sometimes now, during our service, we have students come up and pray, and they're not necessarily able to express prayers verbally in the way that you and I can. But we still give them the opportunity to pray before God. Some of them, they voice syllables, not full words, not full sentences. But I believe those syllables are just as precious to God, just as precious to God as someone speaking out a full 5-minute, 10-minute prayer. Partial participation gave us the ability to expand the horizons of what was possible during worship service, of how much our students can participate. As we set up our junior program, our senior program started to change as well, where now we have as much participation as we possibly can during our senior services. Our adult services, our students are fully involved in every aspect of that service. Because that's the way it should be. They're here to worship God. And we can help them and we can encourage them in any way that we can. One of the principles in education that really brought some conviction to my heart is this idea of the least dangerous assumption. And this is a principle that was developed in the 1980s. And this principle states that the principle of least dangerous assumption asserts that educational decisions should be based on assumptions if incorrect, will have the least dangerous effect on the student. This principle holds that in placing students in an effective learning environment, it is less dangerous to presume competence in a student than it is to presume incompetence. When I first read this, the word that first stuck out to me most was this idea of danger. That it is dangerous for students to not learn in an educational setting. But how much more dangerous is it for students to not learn in a church setting? How much more dangerous is it for us to presume incompetence at church? How much more dangerous is it for us to assume that a student is incapable of understanding the love and mercy of our Father? That's the really dangerous thing. And the scary thing is, as a church community, we do it all the time. When students with certain disabilities come, the automatic assumption is that that student cannot have a place in our community. When students display disruptive behavior, the automatic assumption too often is that that student doesn't belong. And not only is it dangerous for that student, but it's dangerous for us, those without disabilities as well. The Bible talks about the body of Christ as a physical body with different parts having different purposes. When we cut out one of those parts of the body, the entire body suffers. When we begin to presume that students with disabilities, that people, individuals with disabilities belong in our churches, have a specific purpose in our churches, then we can see the whole picture of the body. We can see the body operating in a way that God intended. But when we exclude certain parts, what do the other students lose out on? What do we lose out on? What are the lessons that our students not learning on Sundays that they should be learning? What are the lessons that they need to be learning from church that they aren't learning? And maybe those are the most important lessons that need to be taught and learned. Thank you very much.